Hi, my name's Kirsty Page, and in this recording, I want to talk to you about conceptual understanding, and particularly the conceptual understanding that underpins readiness and supports progression for phonics. So, for those of you with Launchpad, we're going to be talking about the concept skills strand on the Launchpad skills framework, but we're not going to talk about it all. We're going to pick out the key concepts that will underpin phonic readiness and progression. And in an ideal world, I want my children to be ready and already understand all of the concepts that they're going to need to understand as I teach phonics and as I begin that formal teaching of phonics. I'd like my children to understand all of these concepts in a real life concrete way before I get started with the more difficult and the more abstract stuff, but to be aware that as I teach the more formal aspects of phonics in reception and onwards, if I'm working in England, then I need to maybe backtrack and still support the understanding of these concepts with some of my children with language delays, language disorders, but also some of those children who are newer to English. So I think I want to just start off by just reminding ourselves that we all understand about concepts in relation to maths, how they're fundamentally important, but that in relation to literacy and phonic teaching and learning, they are just as important, and the conceptual demands are just as high. If we're thinking about which concepts are important, we need to think about that ourselves, because not a lot of people tell us about this. We're going to need to have sequential positional concepts so that children can understand the language around where sounds are located in a word, be it beginning, middle and end, be it first, middle, last, but also those concepts that I can hear this sound and then I'm going to hear this sound next. So these are tricky concepts, but they are massively needed for children to be successful with phonics. I also need concepts of comparison so that things can look the same, they can look different, they can look nearly the same, but they can also sound the same, sound different, sound nearly the same. And I'm also going to need directional concepts, up, down, round, across, etc. For writing, and also wider positional concepts related to writing, so that this is the top, this is at the bottom, this is above the line, this is below the line, and this is all the way across the page. So we need to first of all understand that concepts are important. Which are the concepts, and which are the concepts we use at our school, or if I'm in a setting, which are the concepts that the school I use, I feed into use, and then consider a more holistic bank of skills for preparation and include conceptual understanding and facilitating conceptual understanding very much as a central part of my preparation process. I also need to make sure that I keep considering this skill when I've got slightly older children or significantly older children who have got gaps acting as barriers. So when I have a child who, when I say to the child, "Oh, cat, what sounds at the beginning of cat?" and the child smiles and tells me meow, I need to consider and bear in mind that maybe the problem is not just auditory discrimination, that they can't hear sounds at the beginning of words. That might be part of the problem, but the deeper and more fundamental problem might be that the child actually doesn't understand the language that I'm using, and they might not know what a beginning is. And whether it's in preparation or whether I need to work on that concept to remove that barrier, it's really important that I and my team understand that, first of all, children need to learn to understand these concepts in relation to real life situation, with concrete objects, with other people, with our daily routines. Once they have that kind of more concrete real world understanding, then we can begin to transfer that understanding into more abstract things. So understanding that Jack is at the beginning of the line, because I can see Jack at the beginning and I've stood at the beginning of the line before, so I know what the beginning of the line is like, is much more concrete than what sound is at the beginning of cat. So need to understand in that kind of real world way, and then I can begin to try and transfer that understanding. So when I'm working on understanding for preparation, or when I'm backtracking for interventions, I get the understanding in place in the concrete way first, and then in the more abstract way. So if I think about working on this, whether it's about backtracking and embedding interventions with slightly older children, or whether this is really a strong holistic part of my literacy preparation, we first of all need to know which concepts are important and which ones we're going to target, because they link to the concepts that we use in reception onwards in our school. But I also need to be aware of different starting points. So some of my children might already know same and different. So my next step would be, do they understand that nearly the same, what that means? And some of my children need to go right back to the beginning of that concept family journey and understand what the same means. And then after the same, we can do different. So what are the concepts? What are children's different starting points, and what would their next step be? And then where are my opportunities? So a lot of the time, I'm going to really just use my learning environment and understand the language enrichment opportunities that that learning environment creates, so that I can use those in a really targeted manner. Of course, I can build concepts as we come together in groups, but the most fundamental and productive way to build this conceptual understanding is to do what I would call targeted language enrichment. So not just me, but other members of my team need to know what those concepts are. They need to know what the different starting points are, but they need to know where are the different opportunities to add that language in a really targeted way. So if we were doing beginning, middle and end, for example, we can do that when the children are walking across a bench, that when they're doing balancing outside. If I've got a little bridge, and a train is going over the bridge, I can add in those concepts. We can add those concepts around stories. We can add those concepts when and if the children ever are lining up. So that what is happening is just what is happening already, but because I've got this understanding and my team have this understanding at the forefront of our minds, which we might not have had before, we begin to add those key concepts more often, much more frequently, and in a much more targeted way. So in essence, I think for me, but also my team, we need to understand why doing this is important. Why do children need to understand these concepts? We need to understand who we need to work on them with. So in early years, that could be all children, because we're preparing this skill in all children, but at different levels. But as the year goes on, it might be that we don't have to do it as much with certain children. We can move on to more abstract and more complex skills because their conceptual understanding is in place. But for other children, we still need to do this quite a lot. And then as I get into reception and Key Stage 1, then of course it's where are my opportunities? Why is this important? But who particularly needs me to backtrack to do this? So I suppose that is about that triad: why, where, and who. And also, as children make progress and as skills change and move on, we understand that we evolve that practice and we tweak it to reflect that progress. And the last thing that I want to say is, when a child has begun that formal phonic learning journey and is finding something tricky, do not forget to consider conceptual understanding. So if a child finds letter formation tricky, of course it could just be an issue with fine motor skills, that they're not at the level they need to be for letter formation. But part of the problem might be the understanding of the concepts in those letter writing mantras. If you've got children who can't hear sounds in words, it might be that they just need to backtrack with auditory discrimination and do more work in this area. But it also might be that the child needs support and we need to backtrack to build the conceptual understanding that they need first. So I'm sure you will have lots of ideas, and obviously all of your ideas are bespoke to your team and your learning environment and your children. But the principle of targeted language enrichment and understanding the why, who, and where pervades our practice, no matter what age we're working with and no matter where we're working. Okay, thank you.